I remember the exact moment. Everything changed between us, though I didn't understand it then. It was the weight of his body settling beside me in the dark, the soft intake of breath that told me he was awake, had been awake, had chosen to climb into my bed instead of keeping to the floor where he'd promised to sleep. The storm had been building all afternoon. I'd watched it through my apartment window while pretending to study, the sky growing darker, more restless, like something inside me I couldn't name. When Ezra knocked at 7, his hair already damp from the first drops of rain, I felt that familiar flutter in my chest that I'd spent 3 years learning to ignore. He came in shaking droplets from his jacket, complaining about his roommate's girlfriend taking over their place again. It was always something. A party he didn't want to attend. A girl bringing too much drama. Some excuse that meant he'd rather be here in my quiet space, where the only sound was rain beginning to tap against glass. We settled into our usual rhythm. Takeout containers spread across my small coffee table. Textbooks balanced on the couch arms. The television murmuring something neither of us was really watching. Ezra sprawled beside me in that careless way of his, one leg bent, arm draped over the back of the couch, close enough that I could smell his soap and the faint scent of rain still clinging to his skin. I tried to focus on my psychology textbook, something about behavioral patterns and subconscious motivations, but my attention kept drifting to the way his fingers drummed against the couch cushion, how his presence seemed to fill the room even when he was being quiet. There's always this energy about Ezra, this magnetic pull that drew people to him without effort. And somehow, inexplicably, he chose to spend most of his free evenings here in my small, ordinary apartment with me. The power went out just after 10. One moment we were arguing about whether the protagonist in the movie we weren't watching was making the right choice, and the next we were sitting in complete darkness, the hum of electricity replaced by the sound of wind picking up outside. I fumbled for the candle I kept on the bookshelf, struck a match in the darkness. The small flame caught, throwing shadows across the walls, across Ezra's face. In the flickering light, he looked different somehow. Softer, more serious than usual. The temperature dropped quickly without the heater. We pulled the blanket from my bed, wrapped it around both of us on the couch, and I tried not to think about how natural it felt to share this small space with him. Our shoulders pressed together, his knee bumping mine every time he shifted. We talked in low voices about nothing important. Classes, professors, his engineering project that was driving him crazy. But underneath the ordinary conversation, there was something else. A tension I couldn't quite identify. The way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. How his voice got quieter as the night wore on, like he was trying not to wake something sleeping between us. When a candle burned low and the cold started seeping through the blanket, I knew it was time to suggest bed. My bed. The only bed in my studio apartment. We'd done this before, shared sleeping space when he stayed over, but always with careful boundaries. Always with him taking the couch, or, if the couch wasn't comfortable enough, the floor beside the bed with extra pillows and blankets. I watched him stand up, stretch, run a hand through his dark hair. He looked around the small space as if seeing it for the first time, though he'd been here countless times before. His eyes lingered on my bed, unmade from that morning, sheets rumpled from restless sleep. Without a word, he walked over and pulled one of my pillows from the bed, dropped it onto the floor beside the mattress with a soft thud that seemed louder in the quiet room. "I'll take the floor," he said, and his voice was steady, matter of fact, the same thing he'd said dozens of times before. But something in his tone felt different. Rehearsed, almost. Like he was trying to convince himself, as much as me. I nodded, mumbled something about extra blankets in the closet, tried to ignore the disappointment that settled in my chest like a stone. It was ridiculous, this feeling. We were friends. Best friends. Had been since freshman year, when he'd helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs to this same apartment. He was straight, dated girls with easy smiles and long hair, never looked twice at guys except to compare notes on classes or complain about professors. I changed into sleep clothes while he arranged his makeshift bed on the floor, both of us moving carefully in the small space, hyper-aware of each other in a way that felt new and uncomfortable. When I finally lay down in my bed, He was already stretched out below me, one arm behind his head, staring up at the ceiling. The storm intensified outside. Rain against the windows, wind rattling the frames, the kind of weather that made the world feel smaller, more intimate. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but I was too aware of him there on the floor, his breathing, the small sounds he made when he shifted position. Hours passed. The storm continued its assault on the building, and I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, dreams mixing with the sound of rain and wind. I dreamed about warmth, about hands reaching for me in darkness, about words I couldn't quite remember upon waking. It was sometime past midnight when I felt the mattress shift. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. The small dip in the bed beside me, the whisper of sheets being pulled back, the careful way the mattress adjusted to accommodate another body. But then I felt the warmth, real and unmistakable, settling next to me in the narrow space. Ezra had climbed into my bed. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. My heart hammered against my ribs so loudly I was certain he could hear it. The storm still raged outside, but inside my small apartment, the only sound was his breathing, steady and deliberate, and my own pulse rushing in my ears. He hadn't said anything, hadn't asked permission or offered explanation. He'd simply moved from the floor to the bed, silent except for the unavoidable sounds of his body settling beside mine. Close. Too close. Close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could sense the careful way he was holding himself, try not to touch me, while lying in a space barely wide enough for two people. The words he'd spoken earlier echoed in my head like a broken promise. I'll take the floor. I'll take the floor. But here he was in my bed, his presence filling every inch of space between us with something I didn't have words for yet. I kept my eyes closed, pretended to sleep, but every nerve in my body was electric with awareness. The mattress was small, meant for one person, and despite his obvious efforts to maintain distance, I could feel him there beside me. The weight of his arm near mine. The warmth of his leg not quite touching mine. The rhythm of his breathing that told me he was just as awake as I was. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The storm continued its relentless drumming against the windows, but I barely heard it anymore. All my attention was focused on the space between our bodies, that charged distance of maybe 6 inches that felt simultaneously infinite and non-existent. This was dangerous territory, uncharted and terrifying in a way that made my chest tight with something between panic and longing. We'd been friends for 3 years. Safe, predictable, comfortable friends. But comfort had never felt like this before, had never made my skin feel too small, made breathing feel like a conscious effort. I told myself he was cold, that the floor was uncomfortable, that this was practical, nothing more. Just two friends sharing warmth during a storm. But even as I constructed these rational explanations, I knew they were lies. There had been something in his voice when he'd said he would take the floor, something in the way he'd looked at my bed, at me, before making his careful nest of pillows on the hardwood. He shifted slightly beside me, and I felt rather than saw him turn his head in my direction. I kept my breathing steady, maintained the pretense of sleep, but I could feel his attention on me like heat from a flame, studying my face in the darkness, perhaps wondering if I was really asleep, if I knew he was there, if I minded. I didn't mind. That was the terrifying truth I couldn't admit, even to myself. I didn't mind at all. In fact, some part of me that I kept carefully buried was singing with his nearness, celebrating the weight of him beside me, the reality of his body in my space in a way it had never been before. But I couldn't move, couldn't acknowledge what was happening without changing everything between us forever. So I lay still in the darkness, listening to the storm and his breathing, feeling the heat of him beside me, and wondered if this was what it felt like to stand at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one small step would send you falling into something you might never recover from. The storm raged on outside, but inside, in the small circle of warmth our bodies created in my narrow bed, everything was suspended, waiting, like the moment before lightning strikes, when the air itself holds its breath. I should explain who we were then, before that night changed the careful architecture of our friendship, before I understood that some boundaries, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. My name is Reese, and at 22, I thought I had myself figured out. I was finishing my psychology degree, drawn to the clean logic of human behavior, the way patterns could be identified and cataloged and understood. My apartment reflected this need for order. Books arranged by subject, coffee cups washed immediately after use, bed made every morning before I left for class. I found comfort in routines, in the predictability of scheduled days and planned outcomes. I had always been the quiet one in any group, the observer rather than the participant. While other students filled the campus coffee shops with loud conversations and dramatic relationships, I preferred the library's hushed corners, the solitude of my small studio apartment overlooking the university's East Quad. I told myself I was focused, driven, that I didn't need the messy complications of dating or social drama. But the truth, the one I'd been avoiding for 3 years, was simpler and more terrifying. I didn't date because I'd never met a girl who made me feel the way Ezra did just by walking into a room. Ezra Martinez was everything I wasn't. At 23, he moved through the world with an easy confidence that drew people like gravity. Engineering major, quick smile, the kind of laugh that made strangers turn their heads and smile back without knowing why. He was tall and solid in the way that made people feel safe around him, with dark hair that never quite stayed where he combed it and hands that were always gesturing when he talked, always building something invisible in the air. We met during freshman orientation, both of us lost and looking for the engineering building, though I was heading there by mistake and he belonged there by design. He'd helped me figure out where I actually needed to be, walked me halfway across campus while telling me about his hometown in Arizona, about his family's expectation that he'd return after graduation and take over his father's construction business. Something about his easy manner, the way he treated my obvious nervousness as perfectly normal rather than something to be embarrassed about, made me comfortable in a way I rarely was with new people. When he asked if I wanted to grab dinner later, I said yes without the usual anxiety that accompanied social invitations. That dinner turned into study sessions, which turned into weekend movies, which turned into the kind of friendship that felt effortless and essential. Ezra had dozens of acquaintances, people who sought him out at parties and called him for weekend plans, but somehow I became the person he came to when he needed quiet. When his engineering projects frustrated him, when his family called with expectations that felt too heavy, when he just wanted to sit somewhere peaceful and not perform for anyone. My apartment became his refuge. He'd show up with takeout and homework, spread his textbooks across my coffee table, and fill my carefully ordered space with his comfortable chaos. I learned to expect him, learned to keep extra pillows and blankets for the nights when he'd stay over rather than walk back to his dorm, then later his shared apartment across town. We fell into patterns. Pizza on Friday nights. Study sessions that lasted until dawn. Weekend trips to nowhere in particular. Driving Ezra's beat-up Honda until we found something interesting or got tired of driving. He'd sleep on my couch without complaint or on the floor beside my bed when his back bothered him. Always careful, always respectful of boundaries I never had to articulate because he seemed to understand them instinctively. To anyone watching, we look like best friends. The kind of platonic male friendship that people nodded approvingly at, solid and uncomplicated. Ezra dated casually girls who lasted a few weeks or months before something inevitably fizzled. He'd tell me about them sometimes, ask my opinion about whether he should call someone back or what might make a good second date location. I learned to listen without flinching, to offer advice that sounded helpful while something inside me twisted with each story. I told myself it was normal, this feeling, that everyone probably felt protective of their closest friendships, worried about being replaced by romantic relationships. I was good at convincing myself that my reactions were reasonable, explicable, nothing more than standard possessiveness between close friends. But late at night, when Ezra slept on my couch or on the floor beside my bed, I'd lie awake and acknowledge the truth I couldn't speak aloud. I was in love with my best friend. Had been since sometime during our sophomore year, when I'd realized that his presence had become necessary to my sense of well-being, that days without seeing him felt incomplete in ways I couldn't explain to myself, let alone anyone else. It was a careful kind of love, the sort I'd learned to carry quietly without letting it show. I never let my eyes linger too long when he changed shirts, never found excuses to touch him beyond the casual contact of friendship. I developed strategies for managing the intensity of my feelings, mental exercises for redirecting my attention when it wandered into dangerous territory. The night of the storm, I thought I was managing it well. 3 years of practice had made me skilled at loving him silently, at being grateful for what I had without wanting more. I'd built my entire sense of self around the idea that friendship was enough, that I could be content with his presence in my life without asking for anything he wasn't prepared to give. But when he climbed into my bed instead of staying on the floor where he'd promised to sleep, all of that careful management collapsed. The weight of his body beside mine, the heat of him in the small space, made it impossible to pretend that what I felt was merely friendship. Made it impossible to ignore that some part of him had chosen to cross a line we'd never acknowledged existed. Until that night, I thought I knew exactly who we were to each other. I thought I understood the boundaries that kept us safe. The morning after the storm, I woke alone. Ezra was already up, standing at my small kitchen counter with his back to me, making coffee like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't spent the night pressed against my side in a bed barely wide enough for one person. Like the careful boundaries we'd maintained for 3 years hadn't shifted in the darkness. The power had come back on sometime before dawn. My digital clock blinked the wrong time, and pale sunlight filtered through the windows, making everything look ordinary again. Normal. Safe. I lay still for a moment, watching him move around my kitchen with familiar ease, and wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe he'd gotten cold on the floor and climbed into bed half asleep, unconscious of what he was doing. Maybe it meant nothing at all. He turned when he heard me stirring, offered me that easy smile I knew so well. "Good morning, sleepyhead. Hell of a storm last night, wasn't it? Coffee's almost ready." His voice was cheerful, uncomplicated. The same tone he'd used 100 other mornings after staying over. I searched his face for some sign that he remembered, some acknowledgement of what had happened between us in the dark, but found nothing. Just Ezra being Ezra, comfortable and familiar and apparently unburdened by whatever had driven him from the floor to my bed. He joked about the storm while we drank coffee, about how the wind had sounded like it was trying to tear the building apart, about how my bed was more comfortable than it looked, said with a laugh that made my chest tighten. As if comfort was the only reason he'd climbed in beside me. As if there hadn't been anything deliberate about the way he'd settled next to me, careful not to touch, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin. I played along, nodded and smiled, and pretended that everything was exactly as it had always been. But underneath the ordinary conversation, I was hyper-aware of him in ways I'd never allowed myself to be before. The way his hair stuck up on one side from sleep. How his t-shirt clung to his shoulders. The casual grace with which he moved through my small space, like he belonged there. When he left for his morning class, he squeezed my shoulder the way he always did, said he'd see me later, and I was left alone with the memory of his weight beside me and the terrible certainty that something fundamental had changed, even if he seemed determined to pretend otherwise. But then it happened again. The following week, Ezra showed up at my door on Thursday night with Chinese takeout and a calculus problem that was making him crazy. We ate cross-legged on my bed because my table was covered with my own homework, and when it got late and he started yawning, I expected him to head home or ask to crash on the couch. Instead, he grabbed a pillow from behind me and dropped it onto the floor with that same deliberate thud I remembered from the storm night. "I'll take the floor," he said, exactly like before. But his eyes lingered on my face when he said it, like he was testing something, waiting for my reaction. I nodded, throat tight, and we went through the same careful dance. Him arranging blankets on the hardwood while I changed into sleep clothes, both of us moving around each other with practiced politeness. When I finally lay down, he was already stretched out below me, one arm behind his head, staring at the ceiling. There was no storm this time. No power outage or candles or reasonable explanation for what happened next. Just the quiet of my apartment, the distant hum of traffic, and the sound of our breathing in the darkness. I must have dozed because I woke to the familiar sensation of the mattress dipping beside me. Ezra climbing into my bed for the second time, moving with the same careful silence as before. But this time there was something different in the way he settled beside me. Less tentative, more intentional. He didn't pretend to sleep. I could tell by his breathing that he was awake, hyper-aware of the space between us just as I was. The mattress was small enough that maintaining distance required constant effort, a deliberate tension that made every accidental brush of skin feel electric. After that, it became a pattern. Ezra would stay over once or twice a week, always saying he'd take the floor, always ending up in my bed sometime after midnight. We never talked about it during the day, never acknowledged what was happening in the darkness of my small apartment. The mornings were always the same. Coffee and casual conversation, Ezra acting like nothing unusual had occurred, me trying to match his easy demeanor while my heart hammered against my ribs every time he looked at me. He'd leave for class or work with that familiar shoulder squeeze, and I'd spend the day analyzing every moment, every word, looking for signs of what it might mean. But the nights told a different story. Each time Ezra climbed into my bed, he seemed to settle a little closer, take a little longer to find a comfortable position. Once I woke to find his arm draped across my chest, heavy and warm in sleep. I didn't move, didn't dare breathe too deeply or shift position in any way that might wake him and break the spell. I lay there for what felt like hours, memorizing the weight of his arm, the rhythm of his breathing, the way his hand curved against my ribs. When morning came and he pulled away, acting like nothing had happened, I felt the absence of his touch like a physical ache. It wasn't accidental anymore. Couldn't be, with the frequency and consistency of it. But neither of us seemed willing to name what was happening, to risk the safety of our friendship by acknowledging the new territory we were exploring in the dark. I told myself it was enough, this careful dance around the truth. That I could be satisfied with these stolen moments of closeness without asking for more. But every night Ezra climbed into my bed. Every morning he pretended nothing had changed. The weight of unspoken words grew heavier between us. The transformation was subtle at first, like watching seasons change. So gradual that I almost didn't notice how the careful boundaries between us began to blur, how ordinary moments started carrying weight they'd never held before. It began with touch. The casual contact that had always existed between us, the easy physical comfort of close friends, suddenly felt charged with possibility. When we studied together on my bed, books spread between us, our knees would brush and neither of us would pull away. The contact would linger, deliberate and electric, while we both pretended to focus on our textbooks. Ezra started finding reasons to touch me during our conversations. His hand on my shoulder when he leaned over to look at something on my laptop screen. Fingers brushing mine when he passed me coffee. Small moments that lasted a heartbeat too long, carried just enough intention to make my pulse quicken. I became hyper-aware of every gesture, every glance. The way his eyes would follow me when I moved around the apartment. How his voice got softer in the evenings, more thoughtful, like he was choosing his words more carefully. There were moments when I'd catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and longing that made my chest tight with hope and terror. Our conversations began to change too. The easy banter we'd always shared grew, punctuated by silences that felt loaded with meaning. Pauses that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, filled with words neither of us seemed brave enough to speak. One evening in late October, we were sitting on my couch sharing a pizza while some forgettable movie played on my laptop. Ezra had stretched out with his head near my shoulder, close enough that I could smell his shampoo, could feel the warmth of his body against mine. During a quiet moment in the film, he turned his face toward me, and I realized how close we were. Close enough that I could count his eyelashes, could see the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd told me about years ago. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, looking at each other in the flickering light from a screen. His eyes were dark and serious, searching my face like he was trying to solve some complicated equation. I held my breath, certain that something was about to shift between us, that this was the moment when one of us would finally acknowledge what was happening. But then the movie got loud again, an explosion that made us both flinch, and the spell was broken. Ezra pulled back, ran a hand through his hair, and made some joke about the terrible special effects. The moment passed, but it left something different in its wake, an awareness that hung between us like smoke. The nights grew more intense. When Ezra climbed into my bed now, there was less pretense about sleeping. He'd lie awake beside me, and I could feel the weight of his attention even in the darkness. Sometimes he'd shift position, and his leg would brush against mine. Sometimes his breathing would change, becoming shallow and deliberate, like he was fighting some internal battle. One night, I woke to find him turned toward me, propped up on one elbow, just watching me sleep. When he realized I was awake, he didn't look away or pretend he'd been doing something else. We stared at each other in the dim light filtering through my blinds, and I could see something vulnerable and desperate in his expression. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, what he was thinking about in these quiet moments when his guard was down. But the words felt too dangerous, too likely to shatter whatever fragile understanding we'd built in the darkness. Instead, I just looked back at him, trying to communicate without speaking that whatever was happening between us, I wasn't afraid of it. That the way he kept choosing my bed over the floor, choosing my presence over solitude, meant something to me too. He reached out then, so slowly that I had time to pull away if I wanted to. His fingers touched my cheek, just barely, a whisper of contact that made my heart race. His thumb traced the line of my cheekbone while we looked at each other. And in that moment, I understood that we were both drowning in the same unspoken feelings. But then, like always, morning came. And with it, Ezra's retreat into familiar territory. He'd make coffee and joke about how tired he was, how my bed was probably more comfortable than his own. He'd gather his things and squeeze my shoulder and leave me alone with the memory of his fingers against my skin and the terrible certainty that we were both pretending our way through something too big to ignore much longer. The weight of it was becoming unbearable. All these careful moments, all these almost touches and loaded silences were building towards something that felt inevitable and terrifying. I could see in the way Ezra looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Could feel it in the way he lingered in my space, reluctant to leave, finding excuses to stay just a little longer each time. We were both waiting for something. For one of us to be brave enough to name what was happening, to cross the final line that would change everything between us forever. But courage, I was learning, was harder to find than I'd expected when the stakes were this high. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in November when the weight of our unspoken truth finally became too heavy for either of us to carry alone. Ezra had been quieter than usual all evening. He'd arrived with his calculus textbook and a container of leftover pasta from his apartment, but his heart wasn't in studying. He kept staring at the same problem without really seeing it, his pencil tapping against the page in an anxious rhythm that filled the silence between us. I tried to focus on my own work, a paper about cognitive behavioral therapy that was due the next morning, but I found myself watching him instead. The tension in his shoulders, the way he kept running his hands through his hair, the distant look in his eyes like his mind was somewhere else entirely. When he finally closed his textbook with a sharp snap, I knew something was about to shift. "I'm not getting anywhere with this tonight," he said, but his voice carried more weight than the simple statement warranted. He looked at me, then really looked at me, with that same searching expression I'd grown to recognize. Like he was trying to read something written in a language he didn't quite understand. We went through our usual routine, but everything felt different, more fragile. When Ezra pulled the pillow from my bed and dropped it onto the floor, the sound seemed to echo louder than usual in the quiet room. "I'll take the floor," he said, but this time his voice wavered slightly. This time, the words sounded less like a statement and more like a question. I nodded because that's what I always did, but something in my chest twisted at the familiar lie. We both knew he wouldn't stay there. We both knew that sometime after midnight, I'd feel the mattress dip beside me as he chose my bed over the floor, chose proximity over distance, chose whatever this was between us over the safety of pretending it didn't exist. When I lay down, he was already stretched out below me, but there was a restlessness to him that I'd never sensed before. He shifted positions frequently, sighing softly in frustration, and I could practically feel the tension radiating from his body. Hours passed. The building settled around us, pipes clicking, the heating system humming to life periodically. I drifted in and out of light sleep, always aware of Ezra's presence below me, always listening for the sound of him moving. When it finally happened, when I felt the familiar dip of the mattress as he climbed in beside me, something was different. There was less hesitation in his movements, less of the careful silence that usually accompanied these midnight migrations. He settled next to me with a soft exhale that sounded almost like relief, like coming home. We lay there in the darkness, both of us obviously awake, both of us pretending otherwise. But the pretense felt thinner tonight, worn through by weeks of this same dance around the truth. I could feel the heat of his body next to mine, could hear the slight unevenness in his breathing that told me his heart was racing just as fast as mine. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence, the careful distance, the way we kept orbiting around something neither of us was brave enough to name. "Why do you keep climbing into my bed?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the quiet of my apartment, they sounded impossibly loud. Ezra went completely still beside me. For a moment, I thought he might pretend not to have heard, might continue the charade that had sustained us for weeks. But then I felt him turn toward me, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been exhaustion or honesty or both. He didn't answer right away. I could sense him struggling with the words, wrestling with whatever truth he'd been carrying alone. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him, because it's the only place I can breathe. The admission hung between us like something fragile and dangerous. I turned toward him, and even in the darkness, I could see the vulnerability written across his face. The careful mask he wore during the day had fallen away completely, leaving something raw and exposed. "Then stop pretending it's an accident," I said, and the words came out steadier than I'd expected, braver than I felt. The silence that followed was different from all the others, charged with possibility instead of avoidance. I could feel the shift happening between us, the careful walls we'd built around our friendship finally beginning to crack. Ezra's breathing changed, became shaky and uneven. When he reached for me, his hand found mine in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a desperation that spoke of weeks of restraint finally breaking down. "I don't want it to be an accident anymore," he whispered, and his voice broke slightly on the words. His forehead pressed against mine, and I could feel the tremor that ran through him as he finally spoke the truth we'd both been hiding from. The confession settled between us like dawn breaking, illuminating corners of our friendship that had been hidden in shadow for too long. I squeezed his hand, felt the way his fingers tightened around mine like he was afraid I might disappear. In that moment, everything we'd been carefully avoiding crashed over us at once. The longing, the fear, the desperate need for each other that we'd been pretending didn't exist. It was terrifying and inevitable and more real than anything either of us had ever admitted to ourselves. The truth, fragile and terrifying and beautiful, finally had space to exist between us. After that night, after the truth had been spoken in my dark bedroom with our hands intertwined and our foreheads pressed together, everything changed and nothing changed at all. We still went through the motions of our regular friendship during the day. Study sessions and shared meals, casual conversations about classes and professors and weekend plans. But underneath the familiar routine, something new hummed between us, electric and unspoken. A knowledge that shifted the weight of every glance, every accidental touch, every moment of silence. Ezra still made excuses to stay over. Still showed up at my door with takeout and homework and that easy smile that had drawn me to him from the beginning. But now, there was something different in the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Something more open, less guarded, like he'd stopped fighting some internal battle he'd been waging for months. The next time he stayed over, there was no mention of the floor. It was a Friday night, almost 2 weeks after our whispered confession in the darkness. We'd spent the evening watching a movie, sitting closer together on my small couch than we ever had before, his arm draped along the back of the cushions in a way that let his fingers brush against my shoulder whenever I leaned forward. When the credits rolled and we'd exhausted our usual post-movie analysis, that familiar moment arrived. The point in the evening when we'd normally perform our careful dance around sleeping arrangements, when Ezra would grab a pillow and promise to take the floor while we both knew he wouldn't stay there. Instead, he turned to me with a directness that made my heart race. "Still okay?" he asked, and his voice carried the weight of everything we'd admitted to each other, everything we were still too afraid to name completely. The question hung between us, simple and loaded with possibility. I understood what he was really asking, whether I was ready to stop pretending, whether the truth we'd spoken in darkness could survive in the light, whether whatever this was between us was worth the risk of losing everything we'd built together. I nodded, throat too tight for words, and watched something shift in his expression. Relief, maybe, or resolution. The last trace of uncertainty falling away from his face. "More than okay," I managed to say, and the words came out steadier than I felt. That night, when we climbed into my narrow bed, there was no pretense about accidents or cold floors or comfortable mattresses. Ezra settled beside me with intention, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin, could count the rise and fall of his breathing in the darkness. For a long time, we just lay there, adjusting to this new territory we'd claimed. The space between us felt charged with possibility, but neither of us seemed ready to cross the final line that separated friendship from something else entirely. Then Ezra shifted closer, his hand finding mine beneath the covers. His fingers traced patterns on my palm, tentative and deliberate, while we both stared at the ceiling and tried to navigate this new landscape we'd created. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible in the quiet room. "I've been thinking about this for months," he said. "About you. About us." I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that I just needed to get some distance, and it would go away. His thumb brushed across my knuckles, and I felt something inside me unravel at the simple contact. But it never went away, he continued. It just got stronger. Every time I tried to stay away, I'd end up back here. Every time I told myself I'd sleep on the couch or go home to my own bed, I'd find myself climbing in next to you instead. I turned my head to look at him, and in the dim light filtering through my blinds, I could see the vulnerability written across his face. The careful walls he'd spent years building around himself had come down completely, leaving him exposed and honest in a way that made my chest ache. "You scared me," I admitted, and the words felt like another confession. Not you specifically, but what I felt for you. How much I wanted this. I spent 3 years convincing myself that friendship was enough, that I could be happy with just having you in my life without asking for more. Ezra's hand tightened around mine, and he rolled onto his side to face me fully. "And now?" he asked. Now I realized that some things are worth the risk. The words settled between us like a promise, and I watched something in Ezra's expression shift from uncertainty to something deeper. Something that looked like the same desperate hope I'd been carrying for months without acknowledging. He leaned forward then, slowly enough that I had time to pull away if I wanted to. But I didn't want to. I never wanted anything less than to pull away from him. When his lips touched mine, it was soft at first, tentative and questioning. A kiss that asked permission even as it was happening. I kissed him back, and it was like coming home to something I'd never known I'd been searching for. The kiss deepened, became more certain, more desperate. Years of careful restraint dissolved in the space between one breath and the next, replaced by something raw and honest and absolutely terrifying. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathing hard, Ezra rested his forehead against mine. "Still okay?" he whispered, and I could hear the smile in his voice even though I couldn't see it clearly in the darkness. "More than okay," I said again, and this time I understood exactly what I was promising him. Neither of us slept much that night. We talked in whispers about everything and nothing, about the months of careful pretending, about the moments when we'd almost given ourselves away, about what it meant, what we wanted it to mean, what we were both too afraid to hope for. When dawn finally crept through my blinds, We were still wrapped around each other, still learning the new geography of whatever we'd become. 3 months later, when winter had settled over campus like a familiar blanket and the days had grown short and quiet, I understood that some transformations happened so gradually you don't notice them until you look back and realize everything has changed. Ezra still knocked on my door most evenings, still arrived with takeout and homework and stories from his day. But now when he settled onto my couch, he'd pull me against his side without hesitation, his arm around my shoulders like it belonged there. Now, when we studied together, our legs tangled beneath the coffee table, and the casual intimacy felt as natural as breathing. The careful pretense we'd maintained for so long had dissolved completely, replaced by something honest and unguarded. Ezra would kiss me goodbye when he left for morning classes, quick and casual, like couples do. He'd text me throughout the day about nothing important, small observations, and inside jokes that made me smile in the middle of psychology seminars. But it was the nights that showed me how completely our world had shifted. There was no mention of floors anymore. No pillows dropped with deliberate thud. No promises we both knew would be broken. When evenings settled into my small apartment, and we were both tired from studying, Ezra would simply look at me with a question in his eyes, and I'd nod toward the bedroom. We'd brush our teeth side by side at my small bathroom sink, bumping elbows and trading sleepy observations about our day. He kept a toothbrush there now, and a change of clothes in my dresser drawer. Small domestic details that spoke of permanence, of a future neither of us had dared to imagine just months before. In bed, we'd lie facing each other in the darkness, talking in whispers about everything and nothing. About his family's expectations and his uncertainty about returning to Arizona after graduation. About my plans for graduate school. About the research opportunities that excited me. About the possibility of staying in the same city if we could make it work. Sometimes we'd fall asleep talking, his hand in mine, his breathing eventually evening out while I lay awake listening to the sound and marveling at how right this felt. How something that had terrified me for so long could become the most natural thing in the world. The transformation in Ezra was the most remarkable thing to witness. The easy confidence he'd always carried was still there, but underneath, it was something softer now, more vulnerable. He'd tell me things he'd never shared with anyone. Fears about disappointing his family. Dreams about building something meaningful with his engineering degree that went beyond his father's construction business. One night in February, during a snowstorm that reminded me of that first night when everything began to change, he turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Serious and slightly nervous, like he was preparing to say something important. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice carried a weight that made me turn to face him fully. The pause stretched between us, filled with the sound of snow against the windows and the distant hum of the heating system. I waited, giving him space to find the words he was searching for. "I love you," he said finally, and the words came out steady and certain, like he'd been practicing them. "Not just this, not just what we do together. I love who you are, the way you think about everything so carefully, the way you listen like every word matters. The way you made space for me in your life, even when I didn't know what I was asking for." The confession settled between us like something precious and fragile, and I felt my chest tighten with an emotion too big for words. I'd known, of course, on some level I'd understood that what we'd built together went deeper than friendship or convenience or even attraction. But hearing him say it, hearing the certainty in his voice, made it real in a way that took my breath away. "I love you too," I said, and the words felt like coming home. Like finally speaking a truth I'd been carrying for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to hold it alone. He kissed me then, soft and grateful, and I understood that we'd crossed another line, claimed another piece of territory in this new landscape we were building together. That night, I fell asleep with Ezra's arm around me and his breathing steady against my neck, and when I woke the next morning he was still there, still choosing my bed over his own, still choosing me over the easier path of pretending none of this mattered. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the world outside clean and bright with fresh snow. But inside my small apartment, wrapped around each other in my narrow bed, We'd found something that felt permanent and true. Looking back now, I can trace the exact moment when everything began to change. The night Ezra said he'd take the floor but climbed into my bed instead. The weight of his body settling beside me in the darkness, the careful way he'd held himself at a distance while choosing closeness over solitude. But the real transformation had been quieter, more gradual. It was in all the mornings after, all the nights when he stopped pretending it was an accident. When we both finally admitted that some risks are worth taking, that some connections are too important to hide from. The floor in my bedroom stayed empty now. Had been empty for months. Ezra had found his place beside me, and neither of us had any intention of letting go.